Over the next week, small changes began to ripple through the school. A freshman who had been an easy target for teasing suddenly had 3 older students sitting with him at lunch. A girl in Maya's math class, who had always been talked over by louder voices, found her peers giving her space to speak. And Bryce himself began showing up at the youth boxing gym Vin had recommended, his once effortless confidence replaced by the slow, humbling work of discipline. For Maya, the change wasn't about suddenly becoming popular. She still preferred quiet corners and focused on her studies, but she walked the halls with her head higher, not because she had something to prove, but because she had learned she didn't need to hide. Her connection to Vin Diesel wasn't just a shield. It was a reminder of the lessons he had taught her over the years. That strength comes from knowing who you are, that respect is earned through integrity, and that silence in the face of wrong only gives power to the wrong. One Friday afternoon, as she was packing her books at her locker, Bryce approached her. He wasn't flanked by his friends this time. His hands were shoved into his jacket pockets, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I started going to that gym," he said. "It's harder than I thought, but they're teaching me stuff, not just about boxing." Maya studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Good," she said simply. He hesitated, then added, "You didn't deserve what I did, any of it." It wasn't a grand apology, but it was real. And Maya, who had learned to recognize sincerity, accepted it with a calm, "I know." As she walked out of the school that day, she spotted Vin's black SUV waiting at the curb. He leaned against the hood, sunglasses catching the late afternoon light, a small smile on his face. She slid into the passenger seat, feeling the weight of the week settle, into something lighter. "How's school?" he asked as they pulled away. "Different," she replied, and after a beat added, "Better." Vin nodded, his eyes on the road. That's what happens when people start realizing who they really are and who they want to be. As the school disappeared in the rearview mirror, Maya knew this wasn't just the end of a bad chapter. It was the start of something new. Not just for her, but for the people who had witnessed what real strength looked like. And while she didn't need the whole world to know who her father was, she knew that those who mattered had seen enough to never underestimate her again. Bryce stared at the paper but didn't move to take it. Vin didn't push it into his hand. He simply set it down on the bleacher beside him. "Or," Vin continued, "you can keep walking the same path you're on, but just know, the world's a lot bigger than these halls, and one day you're going to meet someone who doesn't let you walk away without learning this lesson." He stepped back then, putting a hand on Maya's shoulder in a gesture that was both protective and proud. The moment was so charged that no one dared speak. And then, as he turned with her toward the doors, the room seemed to release a breath it hadn't realized it was holding. But it wasn't over. As they reached the exit, Maya paused, turning back toward Bryce. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried with the same clarity as Vin's had moments before. "You could have picked on anyone else," she said, her gaze steady. "But you picked me, and you'll remember that for the rest of your life." With that, she walked out beside Vin Diesel, leaving the gym in stunned silence, and leaving Bryce Carter with a truth he couldn't unhear and a humiliation that would outlast his popularity. What no one in that gym realized yet was that this wasn't just the end of a confrontation. It was the start of a change. In the days to come, the way students looked at Maya would be different, and the way they looked at Bryce would never be the same. The ripple effect. The Monday after the pep rally felt different before Maya even stepped off the bus. The air outside Clearview High was still the same, crisp, tinged with the scent of freshly mowed grass from the football field, but the way students moved was not. Conversations paused when she passed, eyes followed her, and for once it wasn't out of curiosity or the thinly veiled mockery she had felt in her first week. It was something heavier, something closer to respect, some stud. Ence even nodded to her, subtle acknowledgments from kids who had never spoken a word to her before. She didn't need to guess why. The events of Friday had spread through the school like wildfire, the details retold in 100 versions, each one more dramatic than the last. But no matter how the story changed in the retelling, one thing remained the same. The moment Bryce Carter had been brought to a standstill by Vin Diesel himself. Maya walked to her locker, the familiar weight of her backpack resting against her shoulders. She hadn't asked Vin to come that day. He had been in Houston for a charity event and had decided to surprise her by picking her up after school. Fate, it seemed, had arranged the timing. She could still remember the way he had stood beside her in that gym, not as a movie star or a public figure, but as family. Steady, unshakable, unwilling to let anyone chip away at her dignity. That image had stayed with her all weekend, giving her a kind of peace she hadn't realized she needed. When she reached her locker, she noticed a folded piece of paper tucked into the vent slots. She glanced around, half expecting someone to be watching, but the hallway was mostly empty. Unfolding it, she found a short, scrawled message. Boxing gym at 5 p.m. tonight. B. There was no apology written, no admission of guilt, but the meaning was clear. Bryce had taken the number Vin had given him. Later that day, during lunch, the cafeteria felt different too. Bryce was there, sitting with his usual group, but the dynamic had shifted. He wasn't holding court like he used to. In fact, he was quieter, letting his friends talk while he kept his head down. When Maya walked past his table, the laughter that once followed her was absent. Instead, Bryce looked up and held her gaze for a moment before giving a single nod. Not an invitation, not an apology, but a silent acknowledgement. Acknowledgement of the line that had been drawn and the fact that he had crossed it. It was enough. The lesson. The silence in the gym was unlike anything the students of Clearview High had ever experienced. Even the pep rally drums, which only moments ago had been pounding a steady rhythm, seemed to have lost their voice. Every single pair of eyes was fixed on the man standing next to Maya, the Hollywood icon whose very presence carried the weight of 1,000 action scenes and the quiet authority of someone who didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. Vin Diesel's gaze didn't waver from Bryce Carter, and in that gaze was something far more intimidating than anger. It was the measured, deliberate focus of a man deciding exactly how to handle the situation in a way that would leave no room for misunderstanding. Bryce, who had faced down defensive lines twice his size without blinking, suddenly looked like a boy, caught with his hand in a fire he didn't see coming. His shoulders, normally squared with the confidence of someone who believed the world revolved around him, had slumped just slightly. His mouth opened like he was about to speak, but Vin's hand lifted. Just a small gesture, but enough to silence him completely. Vin took a step closer, his boots making a slow, deliberate thud against the polished gym floor. You think being bigger means you can take whatever you want? His voice wasn't loud, but it carried through the space as if the walls themselves were listening. You think having a crowd means you've got power? He let the words settle, scanning the faces in the bleachers. Some wide-eyed, some guilty, some quietly hopeful that maybe, finally, someone was about to say what had needed to be said for a long time. Bryce swallowed hard. It was just a joke. No, Vin cut in, the word sharp enough to slice through the air. A joke is when everyone's laughing, including the person you're talking to. What you've been doing isn't a joke, it's cow, Ardis dressed up as entertainment. A ripple moved through the crowd. Students shifted uncomfortably because they had all been part of it at one time or another, whether by laughing along or staying silent. Vin's eyes softened slightly, but only when they turned to Maya. You don't have to explain yourself to people like this, he said to her, his tone warmer now, protective in a way that wrapped around her like armor. But when you stand your ground, you teach them something they won't forget. Maya nodded once, meeting his gaze with quiet understanding. She had grown up with this man teaching her the kind of strength that wasn't about fists or shouting, the kind that came from knowing who you were, even when the world tried to tell you otherwise. And now, standing in the middle of a gym full of people who had only known her as the quiet new girl, she felt that truth settle into her bones. Vin turned back to Bryce. I don't care who you are in this school, quarterback, golden boy, popular, none of that gives you the right to tear someone down just to make yourself feel taller. You think you've got respect here? Respect doesn't come from fear, it comes from how you treat people when no one's looking. The words landed like weights, heavy and undeniable. Bryce's face burned red, his jaw tightening as if he wanted to push back, but there was nothing to push against. Vin wasn't threatening him. He was dismantling him, piece by piece with nothing more than truth and the kind of presence that made lies impossible. And then Vin did something unexpected. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, holding it out to Bryce. "This is the number for a youth boxing gym I sponsor in the city. You want to prove you're strong? Go there. They'll teach you what strength really means, and it's not what you think." But toward the entrance of the gymnasium, where the double doors had just swung open, the man who stepped through was impossible to mistake. Broad-shouldered, black t-shirt stretched across a chest built like it was carved from stone, that iconic bald head catching the light, and a gaze that could burn through steel. It was the kind of presence that made even the loudest rooms fall silent. Vin Diesel. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't even need to move quickly. He simply walked toward them, each step deliberate, the kind of stride that belonged to someone who had nothing to prove because the proof was already in the way people cleared a path for him. Bryce's grip on the backpack loosened before Vin even reached them, his smirk long gone. Maya stepped forward and took the backpack back without a word, slipping it over her shoulder as Vin stopped beside her. He didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on Bryce, calm but unyielding. "You want to explain why you're holding my daughter's bag?" Vin asked, his voice low, even, and far more dangerous than if he had shouted. Bryce opened his mouth, but no sound came out. For the first time in his reign over Clearview High, he had no script, no comeback, no control. And as the gymnasium erupted in whispers and gasps, he realized something with a sick twist in his gut. Maya Williams hadn't been bluffing. But every time someone brought up the name Vin Diesel, the suggestion was brushed off with laughter as if it were too ridiculous to be true. Bryce Carter, however, wasn't laughing. The thought had taken root in his mind, and no matter how many times he told himself it was a coincidence, he couldn't shake the image of that photograph in her locker or the strange certainty in her voice when she told him not to push her. And yet, instead of stepping back, Bryce did what he always did when something made him uneasy. He doubled down. If she was connected to someone powerful, he wanted to see how far that power actually reached. If it was all smoke and mirrors, he wanted to tear it apart in front of everyone. The perfect opportunity came during the pep rally that Friday afternoon when the entire school crammed into the gymnasium, the bleachers creaking under the weight of hundreds of students, the air thick with the smell of popcorn, cologne, and fresh paint from the banners that hung on the walls. Maya had slipped in quietly, sitting near the back of the bleachers, half hidden by a column, but Bryce had already spotted her, his eyes narrowing slightly. The principal was halfway through announcing the football team's upcoming championship game when Bryce excused himself from the player section and made his way toward her. Conversations around them dimmed as students noticed the star quarterback cutting through the crowd toward the quiet new girl. He stopped just in front of her row, his voice pitched loud enough to carry over the noise of the rally. "Still avoiding me, Maya? I'm starting to think you don't like me." She looked up slowly, her expression unreadable. "I'm not here to like you, Bryce." The students nearest them turned in their seats, the ripple of attention spreading. Bryce leaned closer, resting one hand on the bleacher railing. "You know, you've been walking around here like you've got someone watching your back. Like you're untouchable, but I think it's time we see if that's actually true." Maya didn't flinch, didn't drop her gaze. "And how exactly do you think you're going to find out?" That was all the invitation Bryce needed. He straightened up, his voice rising so the crowd could hear. "How about right now? Stand up, Maya. Let's see if you're as tough as you pretend." The gym seemed to pause, the rhythmic beat of the pep band faltering as heads turned toward the confrontation. Maya rose slowly, the sunlight from the high windows catching in her dark curls. She didn't move toward him. Instead, she simply stepped forward enough for the space between them to shrink, her calm presence making the noise around them feel distant. "You don't want to do this here," she said quietly. "Why not?" He shot back, a crooked grin on his face. "Afraid?" "No," she said, her voice steady as stone. "But you will be." Something in her tone hit harder than the words themselves. Bryce felt it, though he covered it with a dismissive laugh and stepped forward, his arm brushing hers in a deliberate show of dominance. A few students gasped softly. One of his teammates muttered under his breath, "Dude, back off." but Bryce ignored him. Then, with the eyes of the gym on them, he made the mistake. He reached for her backpack, tugging it off her shoulder like it was a trophy he'd just claimed. "What's in here, huh? Secrets?" he mocked, holding it just out of her reach. Maya didn't lunge for it, didn't even step forward. She simply looked at him with that same unblinking calm, and then slowly she spoke, not to him, but to someone else. "Uncle Dom," she said, her voice still quiet, but cutting through the air like a blade. "You might want to take this from him." For a moment, Bryce laughed, thinking it was just some weird bluff. But then he noticed the shift in the crowd, the sudden hush that rippled through the gym. Heads were turning, not toward Maya, not toward him. That's when he hit the first wall. "She's not on social media," his friend reported, frowning at the laptop screen. "Like, at all. No Instagram, no TikTok, no Facebook, nothing under her name." Bryce leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Everyone's on social media." "Not her," his friend said. "Either she's really good at hiding or someone's making sure she stays invisible." That comment sat in Bryce's mind like a stone dropped into still water, sending slow, spreading ripples through his thoughts. People didn't just disappear from the internet, not unless they wanted to be hidden. And why would a 16-year-old girl need that kind of privacy? He started watching her more closely in the hallways, looking for anything that didn't fit. One afternoon, between classes, he caught sight of her at her locker. She wasn't fumbling with the combination like most new kids. She opened it with quick, precise movements, like she had done it 100 times. Inside, everything was perfectly organized. He noticed something tucked into the back wall, a small, worn photo, the edges frayed from being handled. He couldn't see it clearly before she shut the door, but he caught the outline of a man's face, strong features, close-cropped hair. It tugged at something familiar in the back of his mind, though he couldn't place it. That night, the image kept nagging at him. He told himself it was nothing, maybe a family member, maybe some actor she liked. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized it wasn't the kind of picture you ripped from a magazine. It looked personal, like it had weight. The next day, his chance came when Maya left her locker unlocked during lunch to grab something from the library. Bryce lingered in the hall until no one was watching, then eased the door open just far enough to see the photo again. This time, the sight made him freeze. The M. And in the picture wasn't just anyone. He had that unmistakable look, the kind of presence that made you feel like you'd seen him somewhere important. A deep tan, a muscular build, a smile that was rare but dangerous when it appeared, and then it hit Bryce like a linebacker. The man looked exactly like Vin Diesel. He stared at the photo for a few long seconds, his pulse quickening. It couldn't be, right? Maybe it was just a resemblance. But the familiarity was too strong to dismiss. Bryce shut the locker quickly, retreating before anyone could see him, but his mind was already racing. If that really was Vin Diesel, what did that mean? Later that afternoon, he overheard something that made the hairs on his arms rise. Two juniors from the drama club were whispering near the vending machines, one of them glancing toward the hallway where Maya had just passed. "I'm telling you," one said in a low voice, "I heard my cousin in LA say Vin Diesel's been seen with a girl about her age, adopted or something. They've kept it quiet." Bryce stopped in his tracks, his stomach flipping. It was just a rumor. High schools were built on rumors. But now it was fitting together in ways he didn't like. If Maya really was connected to someone like that, it changed everything. Not just because of the name, but because of what that kind of connection meant. For the first time since she arrived, Bryce felt something he wasn't used to feeling in these hallways. Not anger, not frustration, but the first sharp edge of fear. And still, some part of him refused to let it go. If anything, the possibility made him want to push harder, which would turn out to be the worst decision of his life. The breaking point. By Friday, the whispers had spread far beyond the drama club's corner of the school. Nobody could confirm anything, but there were enough fragments of overheard conversations and half-believed rumors to create a quiet hum of speculation around Maya Williams. Some said her father was a famous musician, others swore he was a retired pro athlete. But before he could tilt the carton, Maya reached out and caught his wrist. Not roughly, but with a firmness that surprised him. The cafeteria seemed to lean in closer, the silence broken only by the distant clatter of trays. She didn't squeeze, didn't make a scene, just looked at him with the same unblinking calm she had shown in the hallway. "Bryce," she said, her voice steady but layered with something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. "You don't want to do that." For a second he laughed, expecting her to back down. But she didn't. Her eyes never left his, and there was something there he couldn't name. Not fear, not anger, but the quiet certainty of someone who had stood in much bigger arenas than a high school cafeteria. "You think I'm scared of you?" he asked, his voice just a touch tighter. She leaned in slightly, her voice dropping so only he could hear. "Not me. But maybe you should be scared of the people who've taught me what to do when someone pushes too far." There it was. The first hint, so subtle, most of the room missed it, but not Bryce. He wasn't sure why those words made him hesitate, why the grip on his wrist seemed stronger than her frame should allow, why her expression carried the weight of someone who didn't bluff. He pulled his hand back, masking the retreat with a chuckle, tossing the milk carton back onto the tray as if the whole thing had been a joke. The crowd murmured in disappointment, some recording students lowering their phones. Bryce leaned back, trying to reclaim the upper hand with a smirk. "All right, Maya. Guess we'll save this game for another day." Maya picked up her tray, meeting his eyes one last time before walking away. She didn't rush. She didn't look back. And as she left the cafeteria, she knew exactly what had just happened. She had planted a seed of doubt in the mind of a boy who thought he ruled this school. What she didn't know was that the seed would grow faster than either of them expected, and that very soon, someone from her past would walk through those same cafeteria doors and turn that doubt into fear. Whispers and warnings. By the next week, the air at Clearview High had shifted in ways most students couldn't put into words. Maya still kept to herself, moving quietly from class to class, never raising her hand unless she had to, never staying in the cafeteria longer than necessary. But there was something about her now, something that made a few people glance at her a second longer than before, something that kept even the boldest from stepping into her path. And Bryce Carter noticed it, though he would never admit that it bothered him. In his world, reputations were currency, and his had been spotless since freshman year. He had ruled the hallways like a king, respected by some, feared by most, and challenged by no one, until her. The cafeteria incident had gnawed at him more than he wanted to admit. It wasn't just that she had stopped him, it was how she had done it, calm, controlled, like someone who'd seen worse and didn't think much of his games. He replayed it in his head during football practice when the coach barked orders and the thud of pads echoed across the field. He thought about it during late-night scrolling on his phone, the memory of her steady gaze pulling at him like a thread he couldn't leave alone. So he decided to do what he always did when someone disrupted his order. He'd find out everything about them, and once he found their weakness, he'd use it. He started small, asking casual questions to kids in her classes. Most didn't know much, just that she'd transferred in from another school across town, that she was quiet, that she didn't talk about her family. The mystery only made him more determined. He checked the school's social media groups, searching for pictures or tags. Nothing. He even got one of his friends, a guy who was decent with computers, to dig a little deeper. Finally, he took the last ball himself, spinning it once before tossing it toward the can. It missed, hitting the wall with a dull thud. His friends laughed again, but this time the laughter wasn't sharp. It was awkward, uncertain. Maya allowed herself the faintest smile, and it was enough to make Bryce's jaw tighten. She turned and walked away without another word, leaving him standing there with the ball in his hands and the uneasy sense that somehow he hadn't won. What Bryce didn't know was that Maya had been through far worse than a hallway full of stairs. She had been taught discipline in places most kids never saw, had learned to hold her ground in rooms filled with people far more intimidating than a teenage quarterback. And while she didn't flaunt it, she carried the quiet, unshakable confidence of someone who knew exactly who had her back, someone whose name could silence a room in seconds, someone who hadn't stepped into this school yet, but would. The Cafeteria Challenge. By the third day at Clearview High, Maya had settled into a rhythm, one that involved sitting at the far end of classrooms, taking her lunch to a quiet corner outside when she could, and moving through the hallways like a shadow. But shadows can still draw attention if someone decides to shine a light on them, and Bryce Carter had made it clear that he wasn't done with her. The hallway encounter had left a mark on him, though he would never admit it. It wasn't about her words as much as the way she had looked at him. Calm, steady, unafraid. In a school where most people bent around his moods, she had simply stood still, and that stillness had bothered him more than open defiance. So when lunchtime came and Maya stepped into the cafeteria, she felt the shift before she even saw him. The space was buzzing as usual, but there was a subtle energy in the air, the kind that comes when a group knows something is about to happen. The smell of pizza and fries mingled with the sharp tang of anticipation. She kept her eyes down, tray balanced in her hands, and scanned for an empty table. That's when she heard his voice. Not the casual tone he'd used in the hallway, but the louder, performative voice meant to carry over a crowd. Maya Williams! Every head within earshot turned toward her. She froze mid-step. Bryce was standing on a bench near the center of the room, towering over his friends with that trademark smirk on his face. He gestured toward her with a dramatic sweep of his arm, like a host inviting a contestant to the stage. Come on over. We saved you a seat. She glanced at the seat he pointed to, a lone chair in the middle of their table, surrounded on all sides. She could see the phones already out, the subtle way a couple of students positioned themselves to capture the moment. It was the oldest trick in the book. Isolate the target, make them the center of attention, and watch them squirm under the weight of 100 curious eyes. Maya felt the weight of that gaze, but it didn't crush her. She walked toward the table, each step deliberate, placing her tray down without a sound. Bryce leaned down slightly so they were face to face, his grin sharpened by the murmurs around them. You've been avoiding me, he said, loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. I think it's time we got to know each other. Why? She asked simply, her tone flat. Because, he said, picking up a carton of chocolate milk from his tray. I like to make sure the new kids know their place, and I think, he trailed off, unscrewing the carton lid, you might need a little introduction. The meaning was clear before the words finished leaving his mouth. A hush fell over the table, anticipation thick in the air. The move was obvious. Spill the drink. Watch her reaction. Post the video online before the lunch period ended. A public mark of humiliation. The hallway test. By the time the second period bell rang, Maya had already memorized the sound of Bryce Carter's voice. It carried through the halls like a signal flare. Loud, confident, impossible to ignore. She had managed to avoid him after their brief encounter that morning, but she knew better than to think it was over. Boys like Bryce didn't let challenges slide. They didn't forget the girl who looked them in the eye and told them, no. She spent the next class pretending to take notes while her mind kept replaying his smirk, the calculated way he had stepped into her space, and the hushed, expectant silence from the people around him. That silence was its own kind of power. It told her that he was used to controlling the narrative. If he teased someone, they laughed. If he mocked someone, they joined in. And if someone dared to push back, she doubted that happened often enough for there to be a clear script. When the bell rang, Maya gathered her books slowly, waiting until the hallway cleared before stepping out. But fate had a habit of throwing her right back into the fire she was trying to avoid. She turned the corner, and there he was, Bryce leaning against the lockers again, his friends scattered around like bodyguards who doubled as an audience. They saw her before he did, and their expressions shifted into that predatory amusement that made her stomach knot. She adjusted her backpack and kept walking, her eyes fixed on the classroom door down the hall. Maya, Bryce called out, drawing out the syllables like he was testing how her name felt in his mouth. You forgot to say hi. The laughter came again, sharper this time. She stopped, exhaled slowly, and turned to face him. His grin widened, and he stepped forward, closing the space between them. Tell you what, he said, holding up a basketball that he'd been idly spinning on his fingertips. Say hi to me now, and I'll forget you broke the rule this morning. His friends chuckled, already enjoying the show. Maya tilted her head. And if I don't? Bryce's smile grew, but it didn't reach his eyes. Then you get to play my little hallway game. It was then that she noticed the empty soda cans set up on a nearby trash bin. A makeshift target. Two of his friends already had basketballs in hand, their postures relaxed, but their eyes locked on her. She'd seen this sort of stunt before, public humiliation dressed up as fun. They'd make her stand there while they took shots, pretending it was harmless, until the laughter chipped away at her. But Maya wasn't wired to break that easily. She had been taught a long time ago by someone whose words still lived in her bones, that fear only grows if you feed it. I don't play your games, she said, her voice even. For a moment, the hallway seemed to still. The smirk on Bryce's face flickered, irritation cutting through the easy charm, but instead of backing off, he nodded toward the can. Then I guess you're just gonna stand there while we play ours. One of his friends took the first shot, the ball bouncing off the wall and clattering to the floor. The laughter came again, but Maya didn't flinch. She simply crossed her arms, watching them with a calm that wasn't fake. That was the thing about growing up moving from school to school. You learned to read people fast, to know when they were bluffing. And Bryce, for all his swagger, was bluffing more than he wanted anyone to realize. The second ball sailed past her shoulder, close enough that she felt the rush of air. Bryce's eyes stayed locked on hers, searching for a crack in her expression, but there wasn't one. The new girl. The bus door hissed open with a sharp squeal, and Maya Williams stepped down onto the cracked pavement in front of Clearview High School. Her fingers tightened around the straps of her backpack as if holding on to something solid could keep her steady. The cool autumn air brushed against her face, carrying the scent of damp leaves and the faint sweetness of freshly cut grass from the football field. She paused for a second, her eyes scanning the massive brick building that stood in front of her. It looked like every other high school she had been to in the last few years. Wide glass doors, a steady stream of students pouring inside, and that buzzing energy that only came with the first bell of the day. But to Maya, it wasn't just another school. It was a chance for a clean slate, if she could keep her head down and stay invisible. That was the plan. It had always been the plan. As she walked toward the entrance, she could feel eyes on her. A few students glanced her way, curious about the unfamiliar face. Maya kept her gaze low, her dark curls brushing her cheek. She had learned long ago that in a place like this, curiosity could turn into whispers, and whispers could turn into something worse. Inside, the hallway was alive with noise, lockers slamming, sneakers squeaking, laughter bouncing off the walls. Teachers raised their voices to herd students into classrooms, but no one seemed in a hurry. Maya held her printed schedule in one hand, her eyes darting from room numbers to locker rows, trying to map the layout in her mind. She was halfway to her locker when she heard it. The kind of laughter that carried weight, the kind that made people stop and look. It wasn't joyful laughter. It was the sound of a group making fun of someone and everyone nearby pretending they didn't notice. Maya's eyes flicked toward the source, and that's when she saw him. Bryce Carter. Even without an introduction, she knew who he was. Tall, broad-shouldered, and walking like the hallway belonged to him. His light brown hair was perfectly styled, and the crisp Letterman jacket on his back practically screamed high status. Around him, a circle of boys hung onto his every word, laughing just a little too hard at his jokes. He didn't look at her at first. He didn't have to. He had the kind of presence that made you notice him whether you wanted to or not. Maya knew his type, confident, untouchable, dangerous in a way that didn't leave bruises but still hurt. She had seen boys like Bryce in every school she had attended, the kind who ruled by fear. She turned away quickly, reminding herself of her one rule, stay off the radar. But fate doesn't care about rules. Because as she passed, Bryce's voice cut through the hallway. Hey, new girl. The group around him fell silent. Maya froze for half a second before turning, her heart giving a single hard thump. Bryce was looking right at her now, that smirk on his face like he already owned the outcome of this conversation. What's your name? He asked, stepping forward just enough to make the hallway feel smaller. Maya didn't answer immediately. She didn't like the way his friends were watching her, waiting for a reaction. She tightened her grip on her backpack straps. "Maya," she said quietly. Bryce tilted his head, pretending to think. "Maya, cute name. You new here?" She nodded once. He grinned wider. "Good, makes it easier." A ripple of laughter went through his friends. Maya's eyes narrowed just slightly, but she said nothing. Bryce took another step closer, lowering his voice just enough for only she could hear. "Rule number 1, he said. Don't walk past me without saying hi." Maya's jaw tightened. She could feel the stares, the anticipation in the air. She had 2C. Choices or shrink away or stand her ground. She looked him dead in the eye and said, "Maybe I don't follow your rules.